Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. My name is Glenn Ford, and I'm here talking to Mike Hutchinson.
Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Mike. We're a couple of games designers, developers, and such like, and we're chatting about how to design better miniatures games. So this week on Rule of Carnage, we do something a little different. We're going to run through some of the comments and questions that have been left on the channel. A few of the comments are things that we need to do a solid half-hour chat on. We'll leave those some other time, but these are just a handful of short, little questions that we can probably have a fairly quick chat about each of, and just get back to some of these questions that have been dropped on some of the videos.
It's like we're a podcast. We have a mailbag.
hey, who knew? Right, in no specific, well, actually, in order of.
Well, I think very first thing is thank you very much, everyone who left a comment. Glenn reads every one of them. I read many of them, but if you ask us a question, we might get back to you. So let's get back to them.
I read all the comments. I try to respond to the ones I can, and these are some that have been questions that some of them I've given my answer opinion to, and Mike has left, or just some of them we haven't really got back to. So first one, there's a couple from Pat Paints, but Pat Paints' first question was back when we were talking about themes. They said, are there themes you just wouldn't touch with a barge pole, that no matter the mechanics, the theme couldn't or shouldn't be fun to play? And I think what I said in the comments was that I think that there's a difference between things that I wouldn't write a game about and things that shouldn't or couldn't be fun. I do think there's a possibility for games that treat serious subjects in a serious way. That said, I personally don't think I wouldn't be comfortable writing a game about, for example, the Northern Ireland conflict, let's say. And I also would absolutely not be comfortable writing anything that was sort of colonialism adjacent. I think that's always something that's very, very difficult. I think the Ireland, because I feel I could be too close to it, as an English person whose hometown was bombed by the IRA, I would not feel comfortable touching that one at all. And I think anything to do with colonialism, I think it's one of those ones where I don't feel like I have any right or sort of position to make comments about that situation. I don't think I have a grounding to go anywhere near that. I don't think there's any that inherently I don't think anybody should do a game about. What about you, Mike? What do you think?
So the thing I'm thinking about is if you believe that games are a form of artistic expression, which I do fundamentally, then there should be mechanisms with the right sensitivity or context or the right author or designer to touch any subject with a game. Now, in the same way that you can pretty much touch any subject with a book or with a movie, like the medium itself is not biased. It's the author or the audience. Now, there is something going on with the sort of the medium of miniature games as we understand it and practice it right now. Like, it has some bounds on it in a way that perhaps certainly literature, but to a degree film as well, has sort of conquered and expanded out from. So I don't know, it also has this other layer of as we've talked about in some other places, a game is sort of played for fun. And so if you're setting up a situation where you're dealing with a very difficult subject and you're asking the audience to grapple with something kind of uncomfortable or horrible, would I write a miniature game about adultery? Maybe if it's about hilariously sneaking out the back window whilst the front door is opening in a sort of a Confessions of a Window Cleaner type of treatment of the material, maybe. But if it's a sort of trois colors blur sort of handling of infidelity, does that have any place on the miniature gaming table? Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because obviously tabletop miniatures games incredibly comfortable dealing with just widespread murder.
Oh
You
yeah,
know, just
yeah, just
killing
the
and
most.
killing and horrific levels of slaughter. But then if you try to consider approaching a slightly more sort of grown-up, realistic version of it, it suddenly gets quite sort of odd and queasy.
Well, I mean, like miniature games are mostly miniature war games, and miniature war games are mostly toy soldiers games, and so you're already rooted in the like in the irreality of a toy soldiers, of a bunch of plastic army men or a bunch of like painted redcoats or whatever. But
I think that one of the things that's really tough for like miniatures games is it's a lot harder to like hide what's going on from the player. I think that there are a lot of sort of art games that approach really, really difficult subjects. And one of the ways that they tend to do it is that they sort of hide off certain information, and then you go through a set of mechanisms, and then certain information gets revealed to you. Like, it's quite a famous one, I think I've mentioned before, called Train, where you're building a train network and you're transporting units to an end destination, and you're sort of told to compete with the other person, and so you knock them back and you try and get your trains there more quickly, and then it's revealed to you that the end destination of the trains is Auschwitz, and it's the Holocaust. And I don't know if miniatures games can't do, because you can see, because you've got the minis, and the minis are very hard to sort of misrepresent and sort of
right, there's not a lot of sort of conceptual sort of fog around them. As you were saying that, I was wondering something else, which is like in miniature games, because I was wondering why a game like a role-playing game like Bluebeard's Castle can be so different in the way that it handles like tone and even the sense of like, you all play like aspects of one character and so forth. And in miniature games, mostly you have quite a discrete set of actions, and so the game can't hide from you what's going to happen, because you move or you attack or you investigate, or like you've got a number of specific things. And so when you read the rule book, as you've said before, like I know everything that's going to happen to these miniatures because the 6 discrete actions they can take exist. Whereas in a role-playing game, in something like Bluebeard's Castle, like you can come up with anything, the characters can interact in any way. And so in forcing a medium where we've got like relationships in space between these models, like we've tended towards, I guess maybe it's because it's also an opposed, it's often an opposed medium. It's like, well, I have to give both sides a set of discrete options, and then that makes it really difficult to hide story or hide surprise or hide a twist of da-da, and it was actually something you didn't expect.
Yeah, possibly. Okay, so Meerkat 007 asks if you have seen or played Moonstone, which is have you? I've seen it, I haven't played it.
I haven't played it. I have some models for it, and I have the rulebook somewhere on, and very definitely in my PDF folders, but possibly on my shelf as well.
Because the models are very lovely, sort of Terry Gilliam-y, sort of labyrinthy thing going on. Which
they're very cool. They got like I had some sort of flouncy sort of shirted swordsman that was really cool.
I'm not sure.
I'll be honest with you. I'll tell you why I haven't played Moonstone. This is slightly embarrassing. It's the only time this has happened. The miniatures are gorgeous, and so I put them together and I based them and I undercoated them and I started painting them, and the paint job just went really, really wrong. I was doing this like classic sort of GW Empire, like red and yellow, and it just was disastrous. It was awful. So I put them in the simple green to clean the paint off, but I did it at the same time as a bunch of metal tanks, like little epic tanks, and I left them in overnight. I've never stripped resin before, and when I took these little Moonstone guys out, they're all like floppy. They're like softer than board game miniatures. So like there's this noble swordsman, and his just sword is like whoop-a-doo, whoop-a-doo, whoop-a-doo. So I'm like, oh, now I don't have any Moonstone miniatures.
I, I was wondering whether it's because Moonstone is based around you having to dig for the moonstones, isn't it? And they're noted with D4s. So it's a game that forces you to use a lot of D4s. And I thought maybe you hadn't got around to playing it just because of your personal disgust.
I don't think you have to. I don't think you have to roll them in that game though. So I think he's he's found an acceptable use for the D4.
You never have to roll it.
I've forgotten the author's name off the top of my head. He and I had a lovely chat on Zoom in the depths of the beginning of lockdown. He's a very cool guy. Another British designer.
It does, yeah. It seems like a really lovely game, and it's something I would like to get to the tabletop. But there's only so many hours in the days to get through all the games. Right, Ron Borchert asks, they would love to hear how you go about organizing your rule book. Also, when working with a publisher, what liberties do you give up? Have you had to rewrite anything? There was a picture when you were redoing Gaslands Refueled, I think you put up on Twitter, of your back door covered with yellow post-it notes and halfway across the wall.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, this is a bit of a sore subject for me, so I will talk briefly upon this. So when I wrote Gaslands originally, I didn't know how to lay out a rule book, and I just sort of went by my own instincts. And in Gasland's first edition, in the Blue Book edition, there's a fair bit of like flipping backwards and forwards. And so I got quite a few comments here and there from people saying that's a little bit annoying. Like I have to put my fingers in 3 different places and flip backwards and forwards. So for Refueled, I tried really hard to find a different way of organizing things. And I shall be honest, I reached out to some professional game designers, and I was lucky enough to have a couple of like old heroes chip in and help me out. And one of them gave me some advice, which I think I might have mistaken, or at least like I badly disagree with. But it seems to be the sort of Rick Priestley approach to things, which if you read his book, Tabletop War Games Designer's Handbook or something, he makes some references to this, which is like, if a rule is important enough, you should mention it 3 times. And what I tried to do with Gaslands Refueled and with A Billion Suns was I laid the rulebook out so that the full game was summarized briefly in like the sort of demo pitch that you would give at a convention table, so you can kind of understand the rough shape of the game. And then you cover the basics of how the game would work the first time you played it before you bump into any of the edge cases. And then you add the edge cases so that once you've understood how the basic engine ticks, now you start to get all the other bits and bobs that make it complicated and tasty and blah, 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 blah. And that's deeply, deeply not how I wanted to or expected to write the rule book, because my brain goes, each section tell me everything I need, because then if I need to know anything about the movement phase, I'll go back into the movement phase section. I look for the little sidebar that says, you know, marching with one boot tied around your ankle is this special rule. And I tried it, and to be honest with you, I'm deeply disappointed with that layout. I don't think, like, I struggle to find my own rules in Refueled routinely. And so I think with the next rule book that I write, whatever it might be, I will return to my instincts, which is clump all of the rules together and then allow layout to separate important core concepts from filigree and decoration and advanced rules. Now the problem has been that I have been working in initially those first 2 blue books were in a very limited Osprey template where you don't really get any say on the design, and the design is not invented for your game. The design is just a template and you just pour your words into it. And that's a good way for new designers like me to get the opportunity to put content out. But like, in terms of its appropriateness for serving rules up in a way that's like really, really easy to consume, that is a terrible way to communicate information, is to say the way that we will design the communication of this information is we won't design it, we'll just pour it into a Word template that has fonts already laid out. Like, it doesn't do anything. So I hope very much that, like, as I get further opportunities to do different games that, you know, you'll see this with Blaster as well. Like if you look at the way that Greg, the designer on Blaster, handled the rules layout for Mystic Skies in Blaster Volume 2, like that is working with the text that I provided, carving things out. Like when he realized that there was a really, really important 4-bullet list that was like, you can do this action, this action, this action, or this action on your turn. He like blew that 4 bullet points out to a whole half-page spread where he like found some little icons for each of those 4 actions, and then it was really clear that like you're going to do one of these 4 things, and it's really, really important that you know about these 4 things. Whereas in an Osprey templated layout, that would have just been like 1, 2, 3, 4, tiny little list shoved up in the top corner. That's turned into a rant about layout, but that's all part of the problem. Is like you can't just write words in an order and expect that to do all the work of communicating a complicated rule system. There has to be some sympathy between the layout, the design, the words, all that good stuff. What was the second half of the question? Did I have to rewrite anything?
I think you covered a certain amount of the second half of the question, which was when working with a publisher, what liberties do you give up, and have you had to rewrite anything? I think although Osprey sort of have that sort of slightly templatey version of their graphic design, I don't know that they ever asked you to rewrite a rule or specifically.
Actually, they did a couple of times, but it was only in very minor ways where one of the editors would be like, we can't quite understand this rule. Are you intending it to mean this or to mean that? But no, the main liberty you give up, which I would give up gladly because it's a constraint that helps. Well, number one is you give up the liberty of never finishing it because you have a deadline. And the other liberty you give up is I will write as many pages as I wish. So for Gaslands Refueled, like I wrote far too much content for that, and it was only 64 pages long. So I had to pull loads of things out of it. And that's great. That allows you to be, you know, constrained. And then for Gaslands Refueled, they were like, you've got to put more pages in, come on, give us all the pages. And then I had to make sure I had enough content to justify a lovely, you know, weighty hardback tome. So it's less liberties, it's more like you have some requirements you have to meet.
Well, I think there's a line between working to a brief and giving up liberties, and I think possibly it's more of a sort of, okay, well, this has to be X many pages as and working to a brief.
I mean, I think there are probably like 2 other ways of working that I haven't had an opportunity to work in. James Hewins, rather, who works on lots of IP licensing things. James of Needy Cat Games, like he has a very different set of constraints working with other people's IP and working on jobs that have like other teams around them and timelines and stuff. And then, yeah, I guess like I'm writing in quite a like I had to sort of say what the book was up front, but working with Osprey particularly, like they're very gentle about holding you to your word. So if you said it's going to be a thing and it's going to have cards for every ship and those ships are going to have hit locations, and you just quietly throw that out during the design process, they don't mind. They're looking for a game that fits the overall brief of, you know, science fiction fleet battle game rather than, you know, specific mechanic that you sold us on week 1.
Yeah. For the watching, Mike has an almost mystical ability to pitch with almost no detail or information, somehow getting commission.
That is not true. That is not true.
Wildly jealous of. So Michael Goulmy has asked, so this is in relation, I think, to one of the chats we're having about A Billion Suns. Within the chat, you mentioned Drop Fleet, that Michael is a big fan of. You said that there were things you would have done differently in Drop Fleet. What would you have done differently in Drop Fleet that you alluded to but did not pay out? Apparently you did during the video.
So let's have a little think back. So there are lots of elements I like about Drop Fleet. So I love the silhouette system. I love the fact that it takes to hit numbers and ranges and it sort of turns it around and makes the range that you can be hit at relative to you rather than relative to the firer. I love the 3 sort of level system, like the altitude system, I think is really neat. I love the abstraction of the cities and the sort of little invasion mechanic. Goodness, what was I thinking of that I would change?
So you talk big, and then
Well, it was a while ago. If you'd asked me that evening. No, I don't have a ready to go set of critiques and commentary on what I would change about Drop Fleet Commander.
Fair enough.
I'd probably make the rule book the other way around. Why do spaceship games all have landscape
the same reason that all spaceships approach each other like that. It's a pretty simple.
The other thing I really like about that rule book is it does that thing that occasionally people do where there's a tiny bit of like micro fiction on every page. So like it does a little bit of world building next to the page number on every page. I love it. It's really good.
Torben Kasterberg. So this is in relation to a chat we're having about Hobgoblin. As asks, has Mike by any chance had a look at God of Battles by Foundry?
I believe I read that comment.
Okay, is that the reason that you have it?
It might. Yeah, I think it might be. I didn't have it until recently. I have not put it on the table, but I have flipped through it. Yeah, this is a like a delightfully old school rule book. It jumps off the page. It's got like crazy miniatures all the way through it, and it's pretty efficient with its rules. It's only sort of like 30-40 pages of rules, and then it's just like tons and tons and tons of armies. So yeah, haven't played it, but have it on the shelf ready to give it a look.
Have had a chance to have a look at it. Jonathan Smith asked, and I sort of responded to this one, but do you have any games in mind that you think handle order of activation and combat resolution particularly well or in an interesting way? I think there's a whole bunch of games I think deal with order activation interestingly. I honestly don't know. Ironic, given that so many of the core of so many of the games we play is about combat and combat resolution. I don't know there's a great deal that really handle combat resolution in what I consider to be a really interesting or unusual fashion. So, are there any that jump to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember the specifics of it, but I have read and reread a few times the En Garde Offspray rulebook, because that's got a kind of an attempt at a sort of sword thrust parry type mechanic. So I would go back and look at that one. The other, of course, that springs to mind is Caveman! Exclamation mark, which you can find on Drive Through RPG or the other one, War Games Vault, where you have to screw up bits of paper and fling them at the opposing models. That's an excellent combat resolution mechanic. I mean, it's true, isn't it? Because they're all sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, how about activation systems? Is there a particular one that you think does something super interesting? There'll be a fade in and a fade out on this part in the video.
That's so tricky, because like when we were in the middle of that conversation, I had a whole page of notes of like the things that I find interesting on that, but I can't summon any of them.
I think there are loads. I think weirdly, for some reason, it's not weirdly. I think that possibly people feel like activation problems haven't been solved, and so a lot of designers are putting a lot of work into doing interesting things with alternating activation. Whereas I think people think that combat resolution has kind of been solved, and so to a degree that's allowed to drift. But I think there's those, like I say, 7TV I think does a really neat thing with its activation system, where you have a sort of a generic resource that affects basically everything in the game, or can be used to affect everything else in the game, and that's what you pay to get your initiative sort of activation. I like, the other day I was reading Dracula's America, and while there's a lot of that game that I think is a touch too stripped down, I do like their activation system for that. It's a sort of playing out of cards system. So I think there.
Yeah, I love that sort of use of cards. I picked up Tombstone from Black Scorpion because I was buying some figures for recreating an old favorite game of mine, so I can play it with my dad, and that has some cards in it, some playing cards in it, but like the core of the system is not driven with playing cards, and it's like it's a Western game, like with saloons everywhere. Like at the very least, like put the cards at the heart of your activation system. Come on.
I think personally, I think long story short on that is anything unusual. I would rather it were weird and failed than that it sort of did what everything else does. That's my take on it. I always get excited when I see a system that I haven't seen before.
It's funny though that you say you feel like activation systems are more varied than combat system, because I suppose there's almost no game that has the same exact combat resolution system. They're all just like oscillations on the same thing, but like it's not like you can pick up a skirmish game and sort of say, oh, like I already know what the dice rolling mechanics are going to be. There's always something people are messing about with.
Yeah, and I think it's more, like I say, more sort of combat resolution there, sort of being the question rather than the combat mechanics, which I think are two slightly different things. I mean, combat resolution, I think, divides down into you get your head bonked in or not, or people next to you get their head bonked in and you get unhappy and run away or not.
So actually, I've just alluded to it. Like the reason I was buying some Western miniatures from Black Scorpion was I took down the copy of the Battle of Little Bighorn from my dad's. I was like, oh, can I borrow this just because I want to have a look at it? And he was like, yeah, you might need to fix one of the Indians. I think they're broken. I opened the box. Every miniature is shattered. It's like it's like a war zone. So I was like, oh, okay, well, I'd quite like to play this with my dad, because we used to play it when I was like 7 or whatever. So I bought some sort of cowboys and Indians to recreate this classic 60s board game. And looking at the combat system in that, it's got spaces. It's not a hex game, but it's got like discrete spaces that your dudes can be in. And the combat mechanic system in that is really simple. It's simply, if you roll a d6, if it's a 4 or a 5, the guy gets pushed back a square, and if it's a 6, he gets killed. And that's like weirdly not very common in miniature war games, to have like a lot of pushback mechanics, like a lot of like, people die sometimes, but most of the time they just get moved backwards a little bit. So I found that like interesting to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, I find pushing people around and moving people back as a result of combat to be very, very interesting, very well worth looking into. So one of Michael Gulmi's other questions is, would you guys consider giving a day's workshop or even writing a book on these sort of subjects? Apparently, because we have so many good things to say. Mike, would you ever consider writing a book on this sort of thing?
Yeah, I'd probably consider writing a book at some point. That sounds like fun.
Would be jolly if anyone was interested in such a thing. And also, I was curious to hear your thoughts on the system in Aeronautica Imperialist version 1. So apparently in that it has a system where you choose a sort of a stance during combat. And I also haven't played it, but looking at it, it sort of makes me think of the old version of like combat within Mighty Empires, or siege combat, at least within Mighty Empires, where you picked different stances and sort of match them out. From what I know of it, like I say, I haven't played Imperialist either, is anything where there's an extra layer of doing a little guess and bluff prior to combat, where you pick a thing and you pick another thing, I'm very much in favor of. I think that's a splendid idea.
Yeah, I might go seek down a copy of that.
So another question from Pat Paints in relation to your feelings about D4s. Does Mike also hate the Egyptian pyramids?
I don't have to roll the Egyptian pyramids. I don't have to roll them. My issue is that when you pick up a D4 and then you try and get it off your hand, it doesn't move because its center of gravity is so low. And then when you roll it, its center of gravity is so low, it doesn't roll so much as just go flunk, like magnetic boots on, schlunk. It's like it's not designed for the purpose. Like it doesn't have any travel. There's no grace in that act. It's just obnoxious.
I mean, it's fantastic for noting things with. It's the best.
Yeah, very stable.
For
yes.
bookkeeping. It's great for bookkeeping. It's just, and it's because some.
And then you try and pick the little shit up with your particularly those small ones. I've got a set of dice from when I was a kid with a d4 that's about, maybe 60% the size of the sort of, the normal ones you get these days, slightly rounded edges. And when you're a kid, that's just about doable. But when you're an old man with dry fingers, come here, you little perisher.
Yeah, one of the commenters suggested making a game with a d4 dice pool. And just out of curiosity, I got...
Yeah, I tell you what, we'll do that. And then I'll...
I did get together a handful of d4 just out of curiosity and just rolling on it going, oh, this is wrong. This is very wrong. This shouldn't be. Oh no, I don't even want to release these. It's going to be horrible.
And do you know what? In that game, when you re-roll a dice, you have to re-roll it 6 times, and only the third result stands.
Specifically. And last up of this collection of relatively short questions, Kevin Hawthorne asks, what do you consider when writing vehicle rules for war games and other tabletop games? So obviously that's a pretty broad one.
Momentum.
Yes, I think specifically in relation to vehicle rules, trying to give them a sense of weight and momentum on the tabletop, because I think that's the main thing that differentiates a vehicle from a human being. For example, a human being, I have to be running at quite a
the wheels
pace. No, I mean, yes, I mean, sure, but I mean, I have to be traveling at quite a pace before I can't sort of turn on an ankle. Whereas even the most primitive of vehicles, once they're in motion, they have a sort of Newtonian thing of tending to remain in motion.
Yeah.
In a more general sense, trying to stay consistent with the sort of design goals of the system, give it players interesting choices, and build a game that's a fun engine. I don't know if there's any particular things that
Well, I mean, it matters so much about like the sort of scale that you're dealing with, because like in a game like Epic 40k or A Billion Suns, like a vehicle is zoomed out to the point where it's just another marker on the table, whereas like in a skirmish game where you're like, it's you versus a tank and you need to somehow outmaneuver it and get underneath it, like the design goals are so stunningly different for that. It's like I don't think there's a sense. I mean, you've just said it, but I don't think there's a sensible answer for like, how do you deal with vehicles in your game? The question is, what do vehicles do? What are vehicles doing in your game? Like, what do they do? Why are they interesting? If they're just a larger unit, why are they different? Like, what's the purpose of them? But if you're trying to sort of explore a story about I don't know, yeah, it's just it's not a question with an answer, in the same way that like, what's the right shooting mechanic for a game? It's like it depends. What are you trying to achieve? What's the design goal?
Cool. Well, there were some other bigger questions that I have listed up and sort of put onto the chat stack for a later stack, but that's a collection of all of the relatively short form, short answer questions that have got stacked up in the Rule of Carnage comment section.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much for dropping those questions in. If you've got a little question, like I say, if you've got a bigger question, we'll try and give it a full conversation. Like I said, if people are asking about activation advantage and modeling damage and things like that, and I have listed those, but we'll need to give those a proper conversation.
To get a large glass and swill those around.
But either way, if there's a big subject you want us to talk about, we will get round to it. And if there's a little something, we'll try to answer in the comments section or do another of these roundups at some point in the future. Thank you to every one of our commenters that we've mentioned in the video. Thank you to all of the commenters And there are a lot more of you that we haven't mentioned in this video. Thank you for being active in the comment section of the videos and following our ramblings and chats and conversations. We'll hopefully get back to you in the future. But for now on this video, if you've watched us to this point, please like and subscribe. I assume that if you've sat with us and dropped a comment, you like some part of what we're doing here. We will catch you all up in the comment section and on social media and on various other parts of the vast internet. But until next time, I think it's going to be goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage.
Bye-bye. See you next time.